Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome tonight. We are delighted to kick off our program of events and activities linked to Yom Yerushalayim by welcoming Professor Marc Shapiro to NER. Professor Shapiro is an academic and author, educator, and all-round teacher. He writes and lectures on a variety of topics, including Jewish history, philosophy, and theology, as well as lecturing online for Torah in Motion. Professor Shapiro currently holds the position of Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Chair in Judaic Studies at the University of Scranton. And he has titled his talk this evening, Rabbi Shlomo Goren, the Revolutionary Chief Rabbi. So I'm delighted and honored to pass over to you, Professor Shapiro.
Okay, let me just say University of Scranton.
Yeah.
I thought you said Wisconsin. No, you said Scranton? Okay. Okay, yeah, happy to be here. I've been at the show a number of times, so I guess this is second best. So being that it's Yom Yerushalayim very soon, it's worth speaking about the figure, the great rabbi who's most associated with it. In fact, just to begin, let me remind everyone of this famous image that we'll speak about of Rav Goren at the Kotel. We'll get back to this and this whole story, I'll tell it. So what I want to do today, let me get rid of this, is tell about his significance and then, of course, deal with his role in the 67 war and his positions, and then really end it in a very tragic way, unfortunately, as we shall see. Rav Goren is one of the most fascinating of the post-World War II Gedolim. In fact, in many ways, his life story, as we shall see, is tragic. First, let me tell you about his biography a bit. He was born in Poland in 1917. His birth name was Gorenchik. In fact, if you look at his early sefer, his first sefer published, that has the name Gorenchik on it. His father was a Ger Chassid. Now, the Ger Chassidic group, I know you have them in London also, it's significant to the story because, first of all, it was the largest Chassidic group in Poland by far. We're told that there were between 100 to 200,000 Ger Chassidim in Poland, almost all of whom were killed. Now, the difference between these numbers, 100,000, 200,000, is because you had in Poland many people. We don't really have this phenomenon anymore. Maybe the old timers will remember it. There used to be a phenomenon of beardless Hasidim. That is, people who went to a Rebbe but didn't look like a Chassid the way we think of it today. And you had many of those. You had many in America. I'm sure you had in England as well, but you had many in Poland. In fact, being that he had 100 to 200,000 people who would listen to whoever he said to vote for, that is the Rebbe, then you can see him as, I would think, by far the most important Jewish politician in Poland. He had enormous power. The second largest Hasidic group, by the way, was the Alexander Hasidim. Supposedly they had about 25,000, and they also were basically all killed. But what was special about the Gerer Rebbe and the Hasidus, and what influenced Rav Goren's family, is that unlike many other Hasidic Rebbes, the Rebbe, Rav Avram Mordechai, was a great lover of Eretz Yisrael. He was one of the leaders of the Aguda, but he was a lover of Eretz Yisrael, as were many in the Aguda. The Aguda was split, basically, between those who had a strong connection to Eretz Yisrael and those who were basically anti-Zionist. They might have loved Eretz Yisrael, but the idea of building it up and having a connection, it wasn't for them. In fact, it was due to the Rebbe's love for Eretz Yisrael that he encouraged his Hasidim to go on Aliyah. Were it not for his large flock in Poland, the Rebbe himself would have gone on Aliyah. He went, if I recall correctly, 5 times between World War I and World War II. He went, and he established a community there. He bought up all sorts of property. The Rebbe today is very wealthy, the Ger Hasidus. They had property in Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv used to be a place for Hasidim, and although they all moved out to Jerusalem and Bnei Brak, I guess they still own the property because they became quite wealthy. In fact, it's even reported, hard to believe, but it's reported that the Rebbe told unmarried women they could go on Aliyah, even if their family was opposed to this. You can see the Rebbe, he died not long after he escaped during the war in Miracles, and he died in 1948, as I recall, right by Machane Yehuda. You could see his kever. Because the Rebbe sent Hasidim to Eretz Yisrael before the war, they were able to survive, since, as I said, the ones in Poland were almost all killed. And fast forward now to 2023, it's the largest Hasidic group in Israel. There might be 100,000 Ger Hasidim in Israel, and their school system educates over 20,000. In fact, now there's 2 Ger Hasidus because they split, if you know that story. So it isn't surprising that Rav Goren's family came on Aliyah. They settled in what would soon be called Kfar Hasidim. Kfar Hasidim, if you go there today, I don't think there's any Hasidim left. You have some religious Zionists, some non-religious, but it was supposed to be a settlement for Hasidim. In fact, there's a great video you can watch by Rabbi Pinny Dunner of London, now of California. And it's about a very interesting person named the Abloner Rebbe, who brings his Hasidim to Kfar Hasidim. The settlement fails. It breaks down. The Hasidim go back to Poland. The Abloner Rebbe comes to America, throws off Yiddishkeit entirely, becomes secular, enrolls in university, and at the end of his life returns to Judaism, returns to Kfar Hasidim, and is buried there. It's a really incredible story. But Rav Goren's family lived there, and they would soon move both to Jerusalem and in Rehovot. By the age of 12, Rav Goren enters the great Hebron Yeshiva. There's a yeshiva called the Hebron Yeshiva. It had just moved to Jerusalem after the pogrom in 1929 in Hebron. That is the Sabatka Yeshiva that went on Aliyah. Now, the problem with the Hebron Yeshiva is that they have many great alumni, but they can't take pride in them because they didn't follow what you can call the Haredi path. You can go down the list. Rav Goren is just one of them. President Chaim Herzog is another. The Supreme Court Justice Menachem Elon, Daniel Sperber. You can go down the list, and there's many such examples of this. In fact, the truth is that the Hebron Yeshiva is not, when you think of yeshivas, it's not a Haredi, it wasn't then a Haredi institution the way we think of today. It had a strong religious Zionist presence, as was the case with all yeshivas then. Rav Goren was recognized early on as a genius. At age 18, he publishes a commentary on one section of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, deal with Kodshim. He was very close to Rav Kook, Rav Zalman Meltzer. In 1935, when he's 18 years old, he begins attending classes at the Hebrew University, where, among other things, he studies classics and Greek. In one of his volumes, you could see that he knew ancient Greek philosophy, and it was at the university that he meets his wife, who was the daughter of Rav David Cohen, the Nazir. There was a Nazir, the first recorded Nazir in hundreds of years in Jerusalem. You can Google him and see pictures of him. And his son was Rav Shar Yosef Cohen, if you know the name, later chief rabbi of Haifa, and his daughter, who was studying at the university, becomes the wife of Rav Goren. In 1936, the Arab riots begin, the uprising, and in 1939, Rav Goren joins the Haganah, the job of which was to protect the Jewish settlements, and it's reported that he was a good shot. Already you could see he's not like the typical Torah great. We all know that yeshiva students in Israel refuse to take part in any defense or army service. So now it's changed a little bit, but it's still a tiny number. But as a matter of principle, the Haredi world opposes army service. Whether those people who leave the Haredi yeshivas and because they can't be part of that should go to the army or not, that's actually a dispute in the Haredi world. Some say then they should go to the army, but some say they should never go to the army. Already we see that in his youth, Rav Goren had a different approach. That a Torah student should also be part of the army. So in 1948, when the state was established and they have now there's no more Haganah, there's Israel Defense Forces, they need to have a chief rabbi ahead of it for a religious figure. And Ben Gurion was very taken with Rav Goren, and he appointed him chief rabbi of the IDF, and Rav Goren would hold this position until 1972. It was Rav Goren who was the one responsible for making sure the army was kosher. There was no assumption that that would be the case. The irreligious couldn't care less. It was Rav Goren who made sure that there were chaplains throughout the army, that religious Jews' interests were not overlooked, that every base had a siddur, siddurim, and a Torah, everything necessary for an army with religious Jews in it. It's hard today to imagine it because you walk down the streets of Jerusalem and you get the impression that there's only religious people living here. It's not true at all, but I mean, you get that impression. Right now, the chief of staff in the army is a nephew of Rav Kook, and he's a Shomer Shabbos, and you have religious Jews all throughout the army. In 1948, in the early 50s, it was very different. Religious Jews in the army were tiny, small, and religious Jews as a whole were did not have a significant role in the state. And even those Jews who were religious, you often wouldn't know they're religious because they wouldn't even wear a yarmulke. None other than Yaakov Herzog, the son of Chief Rabbi Herzog, who was going to be chief rabbi of England till he got sick. You can see pictures of him when he was working as, was it Levi Eshkol's assistant, maybe Ben Gurion as well. He's not even wearing a yarmulke because it was expected that, when you're working in the government, you should take it off. I mean, think how matters have changed. Why did Ben Gurion agree with all of these things? Because Ben Gurion agreed, Rav Goren was able to get him to see the point that we can't have a split in the population, that all Jews need to be able to serve together in the army. And it was crucial for Rav Goren that religious soldiers not be in a ghetto, not have, like they have today, this thing called the Nachal Haredi type of army, where you have the Orthodox in one unit and you have the general population in another. Rav Goren held that the army must be integrated. Something, again, that we take for granted today, but there was no reason to take it for granted then, and there was no reason even to assume this would ever come to be. This idea of an integrated army was actually opposed by the religious Zionist parties. The Mizrahi and Hapoel HaMizrahi, and also Agudas Yisrael, were against integrated units. And for good reason, you could say. How can you have, if you have people who don't care, let's say, about kashrus or Shabbos, how can you have a kitchen that's going to be kosher? How can you have kosher food? How can religious soldiers be together with irreligious who want to eat non-kosher and don't care about these things? Rav Goren had to fight against his own religious Zionist groups that he identified with to ensure that it would be an integrated army. And he was successful. By the way, there were already Palmach units. Palmach is the strike force of the Haganah. There were Palmach units that were exclusively for the Orthodox. And today, the Nachal Haredi, most of the people in Nachal Haredi are not actually Haredi. They're, I guess, what you would call Chardalim, so I'm told. They don't want to be, when the guys who don't want to be in a unit where you could have, let's say, women or a woman instructor, so they'll go to the Nachal Haredi. In one of his early controversial steps, Rav Goren created a unified nusach for davening in the army, so that Ashkenazim and Sephardim would be able to daven from the same siddur. I don't know if anyone still uses a siddur. I did some time in the army when I was in yeshiva in 1984, and they still had those siddurim because Rav Goren was just finished his term as chief rabbi. Now I'm told they're a collector's item, but if any of you served in the army before 1984, you might recall that. For Rav Goren, the army was supposed to be the great unifier, that all these different minhagim that we have in Chutz La'aretz, we're going to come together and we're going to create a new community, but it's going to start with the great unifier, namely the army. So there'll be one nusach, we'll take from the Sephardim, take from the Ashkenazim. Every galut comes and brings things that we can join together to create a unified nusach. He was totally unsuccessful in this, even in the religious Zionist world. Today, if you go to, let's say, religious Zionist yeshivas that have both Ashkenazim and Sephardim, there's no unified nusach. Whoever is chosen as the chazan, his nusach will be used. And so if it's a Sephardi davening, that's the nusach of the congregation then. And if you have an Ashkenazi siddur, you say your nusach quietly. This nusach never took off. Rav Goren also created special prayers. We're going to see he's a religious activist. Special prayers to say before going into battle. Special prayers for pilots, for those in a submarine. It was during his years in the army that he began to publish Torah articles on all sorts of topics. He started a journal. It's called Machanayim. I don't know if it still exists, but it would come out a few times a year, published by the IDF. and he published his Torah articles in it. He begins to acquire a very large following among the religious Zionists. All religious Zionists passed through the army. So even though he did not have a position as rabbi of a city or as a Rosh Yeshiva, he was able to influence more people than any other rabbi in Israel. He made a point of traveling all over Eretz Yisrael, all the army bases, speaking to the soldiers, giving shiurim, answering all sorts of halacha questions. We can see the questions he was asked because they've published a number of volumes now of his tshuvot, 2 or 3, where he replies to these questions. He had to do all sorts of amazing things. He had to arrange burials of dead Israeli soldiers, including soldiers whose remains in 48 were in Jordanian control. You can read his autobiography, which has been translated to English also. He talks about how he had to go into Jordanian territory with under the ceasefire with just one assistant to gather remains, bring back the bones. He had to rule on questions of missing soldiers, including later the Dakar submarine. It is lost in 1968 with a crew of 69. It was found, by the way, in 1999. I think maybe left France, I forget. But here you have it's a classic case of an aguna. They leave on a submarine and it never arrives, and you don't know where it is. Rav Goren had ruled on that to allow the women to remarry. There is there's a biography. It's not a hagiography. It's not an art scroll biography. It's not an academic biography. It's somewhere in the middle. And it tells the following story, that there was a certain paratrooper base that did not want to go kosher. Remember, I said that once the IDF is formed, the rule is every base has to go kosher. Well, easier said than done, because there was one paratrooper base that refused to go kosher. The commander of the base was actually Ariel Sharon, who had no religious connections whatsoever. And Rav Goren said to him, you have to make this base kosher. And Sharon said, this is the story, that we have not one paratrooper who's religious. So what do we need a kosher base for? He said, if we get religious paratroopers, then we'll make it kosher. Rav Goren himself went through paratrooper training, and on one jump, even broke a leg, but he earned his wings, as they say, and therefore he was the first religious paratrooper. And as the story says in the book, he was able to present himself to Sharon and say, I'm now a paratrooper, and the base has to be made kosher. And it was made kosher. That's the story in the book. Now, when I told this story once, there was someone in an audience. He has since passed away. His name is David Lando, Dr. David Lando. He's from my town, West Orange, New Jersey. His grandfather was Tzvi Pesach Frank, chief rabbi of Jerusalem. And he lived with his grandfather for part of the time when he was young. He too was at the Hebron Yeshiva. And he knew Rav Goren well. Rav Goren lived across the street. He told me he even signed Rav Goren's cast after Rav Goren broke his leg. But he told me that the reason Rav Goren did the parachutes is not because of an army base that needs to go kosher or anything like that. It was because he wanted to advance in the army, to become a general, an aluf. And anyone who wanted to advance in the army had to do a couple of maybe 3, however many, 2, I don't know, parachute jumps. So whatever the truth is, whether he did the parachute jumps because he had to make the big army base kosher, or whether because he wanted to become a general, one thing we can be sure of is that he's the only gadol b'Yisrael, the only gadol to have ever jumped out of a plane. I think it's fair to say that now, although come back in 20 years, because right now you have religious paratroopers and Hezra yeshivas and other yeshivas. So I bet you we will have Gadol Yisrael in the future who've done that as well. In the 1980s, Rav Goren published a few volumes called Meshiv Milchama, which were all the halachic issues that came up during his army service. Today, there's all sorts of halachic works focused on army life, including one from Rabbi Nachum Rabinovich, or maybe in London, I don't know if you pronounce it Rabinovich or Rabinovich, former principal of Jews College, but Rabbi Sachs is Rebbe, as he liked to say. But Rav Goren was the first to publish a book in this area. Rav Goren would resurrect entire areas of Jewish law that had been forgotten or regarded as theoretical. That is, in Messianic days, we can answer these questions. But that's not Rav Goren's approach. The questions he dealt with were simply not of concern to the Haredim. These, like I said, there's no Shulchan Aruch, for instance, or halachic tradition at all as to how to run an army with all the Shabbos problems. how to fight a war. How are you supposed to, in general, all the questions in the new state of Israel, you can't look in the Shulchan Aruch. Take, for instance, the Shulchan Aruch assumes that there's always going to be a non-Jew around. So on Shabbos, there's always things you can have a non-Jew around. But let's say you're in Israel and you're living in a town where there are literally no non-Jews, or an army base, no non-Jews. What are you supposed to do then? We don't have the answers in our classic sources. So Rav Goren had to create a new code. You might even be surprised by some of the conclusions he comes to in his halachic writings. For example, if you recall, was it 1982? Israel invades Lebanon. They go through Lebanon and they come to Beirut, and they surround Beirut. They're in East Beirut, and the PLO is in West Beirut. And the big question was, does Israel go in? I think by then they had lost maybe 500 soldiers, and the estimates were they'd lose another 500 soldiers. But they had Arafat and the PLO trapped because the Navy, Israeli Navy, was in the Mediterranean Sea. So there were some people, Sharon and others, who are arguing now's the time to move in and crush the PLO. And others were telling Begin that you're going to go in, you're going to crush them, we're going to lose a lot of soldiers, but it's not the end because you don't have a PLO problem because of Arafat. You have Arafat because there's a Palestinian issue. In the end, as we all know, Begin allows the Palestinians to leave, and they leave West Beirut, show up move to Tunis, where they remained. I'm leading, in another month and a half, I'm leading the first kosher tour from America, I think from anywhere outside of France, to Tunisia no one's dropped out after what happened in Jerba, which is right, because, we shouldn't, just because people do terrorism, as every other week in Israel, you have terrorism. We have to, do what we need to do. So the hotel we're staying at, I went to check it out. I do tours in the summer. I always have to check out the hotels for Shabbos issues. If any of you want to come on that trip, or my trip to Portugal or Greece this summer, just go to TorahInMotion.org and you'll see all the details, including discounts for people listening. So when you come in, they have a book, and they have a book of all the important people who've stayed in the hotel. Movie stars, politicians from America, and then of course you have Yasser Arafat right in the middle. So we're going to be staying in the same hotel, unfortunately. Right when the PLO was surrounded, again, soldiers on the east, Navy on the west, Rav Goren publishes an article in Hatzofet, the religious Zionist newspaper, stating that according to Jewish law, based on what the Gemara says, the Israeli army is obligated to allow the PLO, leave an opening for them to escape. Because if you look in the Gemara, that's how it describes war. You're not supposed to surround them entirely. You're supposed to leave an opening for them to escape. Rav Shal Yisraeli, another leading religious Zionist rabbi at the time, was very critical of Rav Goren, outraged. He said, first of all, this halacha that you have to leave an opening doesn't apply to Mechemes Mitzvah, an obligatory war. It's only a Mechemes Rishus, an optional war. Second of all, it doesn't apply if when the people, as soon as they get out, they're going to turn around to try to kill you. But Rav Goren disagreed, and he thought that this is the halacha, and we can't be concerned with what happens when they leave. Are they going to continue? We have to follow the halacha. Rav Goren also writes about prisoners. There's a halacha that if someone is kidnapped, and that used to be a well-established profession, kidnapping Jews. The Knights of Malta did it. They always used to do this. They would take ships. Pirates would grab the ships, and it actually was safe because they didn't kill the Jews, but they would kidnap them because they know that Jews would always redeem other Jews. Pidyon Shvuyim. So then, they go to the Jews of Italy and mostly Italy, Eretz Yisrael. They tried to redeem the Jews, North Africa, and Jews would pay money for other Jews. So, and this has been going on since Talmudic times. And because of this, the rabbis of the Gemara say that you cannot redeem someone more than their worth. We like to say that human life has no value, but at the end of the day, if there's ever an accidental death and you go to court, they have to come up with some sort of value. And the rabbis also said you can't redeem more than someone's value. In other words, if these brigands, these ruffians, kidnap a Jew, and then they tell the Jewish community, we'll give the person back, but it's going to cost you $4 billion. You're not allowed to pay that. The Gemara says you can't pay that because even if the person's going to die, because by you paying it, it's going to lead to more kidnappings. And therefore, we can't do that. Rav Goren says, however, he points out, first of all, there's exceptions. We know there's exceptions. The community can't pay $4 billion, but if you're Elon Musk and it's your son, you could pay the $4 billion. You're allowed to. But when it comes to the community, Rav Goren says, argue that there's an exception. He says that's just general rule. However, a state that has an army can pay whatever it wants to pay. And we're not concerned that by paying too much, we're going to endanger the population at large by releasing terrorists, because when we send the soldiers into war, soldiers are different than civilians. The soldier puts his life on the line at risk for the citizenry, and we make a commitment to the soldiers, he says, that we will bring them back, even if it means putting the citizenry at risk for the future. And that was Rav Goren's position. As you know, Israel has made all sorts of crazy trades. They'd give back to get a couple dead bodies. They would release hundreds of terrorists. The Gilad Shalit situation, there was disputes over this. Some people said it shouldn't be done because these people go back to terrorism. But Rav Goren held that this is a political decision. Whatever the government decides is halachically appropriate because they don't have to release 100 terrorists to get one back, but they're allowed to because the soldiers are different. One ruling which shocked Israel was when Rav Goren, who's known as a big right-winger, he declared that the Golan Heights is not part of biblical Israel. He's not saying that it should be given back. He's saying, however, it can be given back. It's simply a security question. It's not, there's no halachic prohibition. We're going to see what he says about Yehuda and Shomron, the West Bank, in a minute, but there's no halachic prohibition on returning to Golan. In the introduction to his books, Meshiv Mohammed, he has 4 volumes, he writes about the preciousness of all life. Elsewhere, he writes that a non-Jewish soldier killed fighting in Israel's army is to be buried in a Jewish cemetery if that's what the family wants. For example, a lot of these Russian immigrants today, they're not halachically Jewish. But this essay about the preciousness of all life, let me just mention again, there was a Reform rabbi in Israel named Moshe Zemer. He recommended that this be translated to English because, I mean, people have this impression of Rav Goren as an extremist or this. You might find some of his views extreme, but I mean, he waxes eloquent there about that we don't want war and that how you have, life is so important, all life. Now, in his books and his articles on war, he uses not just rabbinic sources, but historical sources. So, for example, from the Apocrypha, from Josephus. Remember, when's the Talmud written? The Talmud is written at a time when their Jews no longer had power. They're living in Babylonia or Eretz Yisrael, but they don't have power. So if you want to see how Jews behaved and acted when they actually had power, had an army, you have to look at earlier sources. You have to look at the Apocrypha. You have to look at the earlier prophets. You have to look at Josephus, pre-Talmudic sources. There's an article by a scholar in Israel called Aryeh Edrei, and he deals with Rav Goren and the military ethic of the IDF. And he says, as he puts it, Rav Goren sought to reconnect the biblical attitude towards power with the rabbinic attitude, and thus to create a corpus that will be relevant to modern times. Now, this is important. We Jews are supposed to have power. When we lived in the land of Israel, we had power. King David had power. He had an army. With the Galut, we lost power. So for almost 2,000 years, we didn't have power. But this is not the way Jews are supposed to live. Jews are supposed to rule themselves, and they're supposed to have power, but we forgot what it meant to have power. So now that Jews have returned to the land of Israel, Jews need to once again learn how to be a free people in charge of its destiny, and that means not just to be a Torah scholar, it means to have an army, it means to exercise power. And we can look at how Jews exercise power in the pre-Talmudic sources. Now, it's true that the sages, Chazal, put the stress on spiritual heroism. And this continues in the Haredi world. The Haredi world doesn't want to hear about heroism. You talk about the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt. No, nothing. We don't want to talk about that. We talk about heroism for us is spiritual heroism. And of course, the irreligious, all they know is physical heroism. Rav Goren said they're both wrong. Obviously, you need spiritual heroism, but you also need physical heroism. And that's what it means to be a complete Jew. The Haredim are still living in the Galut. They're living like they're living in, they could be living in Bnei Brak, but it's like they're living in Warsaw 100 years ago, because now that we're in our own land, you're no longer in the desert, as it were, before you entered Eretz Yisrael. Yes, Jews lived in the desert for 40 years, but then they entered Eretz Yisrael, they had to live as complete people. And that's Rav Goren's great criticism of the Haredi world, that they continue living as if they're living in the Galut, not as if they're living in charge of their own destiny. We need to have a synthesis of physical power and spirituality. In 1948, Rav Goren is still very respected by the yeshivas, the right-wing yeshivas. They weren't called Haredi then. In fact, on one Shabbos in the war, he was able to round up numerous yeshiva bachrim to dig trenches, because they received, he writes about this in his autobiography, he received word that the Jordanian army might be advancing. He was still respected by what we would later call the Haredim, as one who was making a big Kiddush Hashem. The great disagreements would come later. He wrote many books during this time, as in fact we're told that he tells us that he tried to do 7 blot a day of Gemara every day. So finish Shas every year. He wrote many books while he was serving as chief chaplain. I don't know how he found the time, but he did, following his early work. And some of this is actually the books I'll give you now, predate his chief chaplain. Following his early work on the Rambam, he published a commentary on brachos of the Jerusalem Talmud. As with Rav Kook, Rav Goren had a special love for the Jerusalem Talmud. One of his arguments in favor of a welcoming attitude towards converts is that the Talmud Bavli says that converts are difficult for Israel. And throughout our time in the diaspora, we always pushed converts away, made it difficult for them. Rav Goren says that this passage does not appear in the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, and he sees this as a sign that in Eretz Yisrael, the sages were more open to converts, presumably because of the holiness of the land. Rav Goren acted on this himself in one of his most controversial rulings. With Rav Goren, you find things that no one else ever said. Rav Goren would convert people and give them a conversion certificate that said that it's only valid in Israel. Who ever heard of such a thing? Either you're Jewish or you weren't Jewish. What do you mean? You're Jewish here, but you're not Jewish in England? Rav Goren insisted that this did not mean that the person was Jewish in Israel and non-Jewish in Chutz La'aretz, but only that the convert could not use the conversion certificate outside of Israel. It's hard to see the difference if you can't use it. In fact, other than Rav Goren, everyone else assumed that this meant it's a conditional conversion, only valid in Israel. What else could it mean? I don't know if you know this, that it was one of these certificates of Rav Goren that created all these problems in London that led to, I can't remember the name of the woman, Your Bastin refused to recognize her as Jewish because she comes to England and she's not religious. And the conversion certificate from Rav Goren said that only valid in Eretz Yisrael. And I believe it's one of her children that weren't allowed in the Jewish schools that now had the court case that you have to allow non-Jews in your schools. I believe it's that woman's children, and it's one of Rav Goren's certificates. But Rav Goren's position, and it was based on the notion that only in Israel can we be so open to converts, but if they leave Israel, they wouldn't have accepted them as converts in Chutz La'aretz. That's why they can't use a certificate. Rav Goren held that we will convert people here in Eretz Yisrael, but we will not convert them in Chutz La'aretz. But we convert them in Eretz Yisrael because they agreed to remain in Israel, and they agreed to raise their children here. We don't need to have this high standards in Chutz La'aretz. And if they go to Chutz La'aretz, they can't use the conversion certificate. That's what he says. This ruling only became known this approach only became known when he was chief rabbi. And in fact, until the late 1960s, everyone knew he was different, but the extent of his halachic vision, his unique vision, was unknown. And he didn't create waves. Since, look, the army is where he was in control, and that's not a place for the Haredim. And people in the Haredi world, I think, were grateful he was there, since the typical Haredi rabbi wouldn't have been able to relate to the irreligious and the officers and the government figures like he could. So his eccentricities were tolerated. And he was eccentric. He once took a helicopter to Har Sinai after 67, and he completed writing a Sefer Torah there. Now, this is interesting, to put it mildly, unusual. Well, first of all, Mount Sinai, where the St. Catherine's Monastery is, that's not even a Jewish site. We have no identification of Mount Sinai. It's a Christian site. But he went there. The Haredim like to point out his eccentricities. Rabbi Mordechai Elephant, the old Rosh Yeshiva, deceased Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivas Itri, he has a memoir, a very interesting memoir. And in his memoir, he recalls that Moshe Dayan asked him, why did Rav Goren go to Har Sinai? And Rav Elephant replied, quote, to give back the Torah. And Elephant mentions that Moshe Dayan laughed so hard that his eye almost flew out. That is his remaining eye. But truth be told, Rav Goren was a walking Kiddush Hashem. He went around the world, everywhere, including Iran, Japan, he went everywhere, giving shiurim, and always in his army uniform. From 48 till 72, everywhere he goes is in his army uniform. He used to come to Yeshiva University and give shiur in Rav Soloveitchik's class. Rav Soloveitchik would have him give the shiur, and always in his uniform, which was the visible symbol of the Jewish state. People saw him as Israel reborn, a modern-day King David, namely a Torah scholar who's also a soldier. That's how King David's portrayed. I heard from Joseph Kaplan, I don't know if the name means anything to you, but maybe not the English people, but those who watch it later on YouTube, from, I guess, Long Island he is now, I think. But he told me that he grew up in Far Rockaway. No, Teaneck. Joseph was in Teaneck. He grew up in Far Rockaway, and he went to a show called The White Show. And one day in the 1950s, Rav Goren came to this show in his uniform, and when he walked in during davening in his uniform, he was coming to preach the sermon. That is, he had davened somewhere else, and he came to this show, and he'd speak at various shows over Shabbos. When he came in the middle of davening, people began to clap, he recalls, stood up and clapped, and it was a very moving scene. Now, this was a decade after the Holocaust, which was the ultimate expression, of Jewish weakness. And now, in the 50s, there's a Jewish army, and a rabbi is wearing the uniform. This gave incredible pride to the Jews, including Holocaust survivors, there to see Rav Goren. By the early 1960s, I think it's fair to say that among young people in Israel, Rav Goren is the most popular religious Zionist in the world. And he was a character, if any of you met him. I was together with him a couple of times, and I even spoke to him once. He's very lively. You can see videos of him on YouTube. Interviews, things being on a television show. Everything changes in 67. That's when he breaks out of his army show. Many things happen in 67. Obviously, we all know about East Jerusalem, the old city. But for our purposes, the most important thing is the creation of right-wing religious Zionism. Gush Emunim would come into being in 74, but settlement type of Zionism, that comes to the fore right after 67. Carrying his Sefer Torah and shofar, Rav Goren was with the first troops that reached the Kotel. And let me show you again. This is the famous picture. When I showed this picture once, someone even said that there's something significant about the way he's holding the shofar in his mouth, that it's not on the side like most people blow it, but it's in the front. Apparently, there's some Kabbalistic reason why it's better to blow it that way. I don't know, but he's with the troops, the first troops that reached the wall. You can, in his autobiography, he describes this. He's blowing the shofar. The Torah says that you blow chatzotzeros. I guess he has now the big trumpet when you go to war. But he describes blowing the shofar, and he's right behind the soldiers, making his way into the old city. And they fought their way into the old city. Before that picture was taken, which is him in front of the Kotel, the soldiers came onto the Temple Mount, and then they descended to the Kotel. Before he descends, he's on the Temple Mount. He spends time there, which is permitted because it was during conquest. He would actually set up a Beit Midrash there. Half of it was on the Temple Mount. And after the war, he started giving shiurim there. The government forced him to stop. This is the first of a number of confrontations he would have with the government. Now, while he's on the Temple Mount, and you can see a picture of him on YouTube, there's a picture of him, of the conquering of the old city. He has a little Sefer Torah also. While he's on the Temple Mount, he takes measurements. to know what is, where is permissible to walk, where not. It was only after he was no longer chief rabbi that he published these measurements. He leaves chief rabbinate 84, I think. It was only after he's no longer chief rabbi that he published these measurements, showing people exactly, no, 82. That's when he finished chief rabbinate. Only after he's no longer chief rabbi, he published these measurements, which show where you, at least in his mind, where you can go and where you can't go on the Mount. It's now very common for religious Jews to go up on the Temple Mount. I'm sure there's people listening to us right now who have been up there. But those of you who are age 50 and older will remember that when we were young, not even so long ago, 25 years ago and more, the United Jewish Appeal, the non-Orthodox groups, they all would go on the Temple Mount. But one thing we all knew was that Orthodox Jews don't go on the Temple Mount. There was even a sign there, still there, that Chief Rabbi rules you can't go on a Temple Mount. After Rav Goren gives his permission, slowly groups started going up. And it's now very popular. And you have many great rabbis who support going up. In fact, I would venture to say that among the religious Zionist population, half of the religious Zionist world now goes up on the Temple Mount, and you can go up every day you go there. You can go up. I know people who go up every single time they go to Israel. They go up. Rabbi Tendler, if the name means anything to you, or Moshe Feinstein's son-in-law, you can watch a video of him on YouTube. Just Google, you go to YouTube, Rabbi Tendler Temple Mount, and you'll see him on the Temple Mount discussing why he goes up. It's not about tourism. It's about a connection to the holiest Jewish site, or to show that Jewish sovereignty extends to the Temple Mount. Whatever the reason is, many people go up. I've never been up, but many people, my son, he asked me, should he go up? I said, I wouldn't recommend it. And as children will do, he sent me a picture the next day of him with a whole group of others on the Temple Mount. In 1962, Rav Goren actually said that if we ever do conquer the Temple Mount, we would be obligated to rebuild the temple. Easier said than done, being that there's a couple big buildings right there that it would start World War III if we decided to tear them down. It's due, although he did not succeed in the Temple Mount, keeping a Beit Midrash up there, it's due to Rav Goren that Jews were given permission to daven at Maras HaMachpelah. The plan of the government was to forbid this. The plan of the government was to bring everything back to the status quo. And they thought after this great victory, the Arabs would sue for peace. Israel would keep maybe some settlements like Gush Etzion and maybe along the Jordan River. But, the Arabs didn't go for it. Now in Hebron, Jews were able, I forget which step they're able to walk up, but they can never enter it. The story of his time in Hebron, and I heard this personally from Dudu Fisher. Dudu Fisher, the great singer, Broadway performer, Chazan, and I heard someone told me that he stars in this new Netflix movie about the diamond people in Antwerp, that he's in that. I assume he's performed, maybe as Les Miserables, maybe performed in London, I don't know, he used to perform in Broadway. He told me the following, because when he was in the Army, he had one, I guess, the easy Army jobs. He was in the Army choir. So he'd go around performing and singing. And he would go with Rav Goren often. And he told me that that Rav Goren, when he leaves Jerusalem and then goes direction of Hebron, he speeds up on his Jeep. He's among the first of the soldiers. The major army group is behind him, one of the first of the soldiers to reach Hebron. You might think this is dangerous, if the real troops are still behind you, but it wasn't, because the Arabs were terrified. Many of them had fled. The others were locked up. He said that when he came to Hebron, the streets were deserted. They were terrified. In those days, they were terrified. And Rav Goren finds the person who is in charge, has the key to Maras Machpelah. They open it up, and he goes in, and they have a minyan there. And since that time, we were able to, Jews are able to go to Maras Machpelah. Although Moshe Dayan wanted to stop it, he wasn't able to. Okay, getting back to the time on the Temple Mount. He comes down to the wall, and they daven mincha. And in the repetition of the Shemona Esrei, Rav Goren reads the Nachem prayer. There's a prayer we say on Tisha B'Av, Nachem. He read it. It's not Tisha B'Av, but he read it, and he changes the version. The Nachem prayer says, it talks about the mourning, Velos, city of mourning, Mouring. He changes it to the liberated city, joyful and exultant, whose children have returned to her. He also says Hallel with a bracha. And he says Shechayanu with a bracha. You can go, I don't know if you can hear on YouTube the entire davening, but you can definitely hear him saying Shechayanu with a bracha. You might be able to hear the Shemona Esrei also. What's going on here? It's not Tisha B'Av. Why is he saying a prayer? Well, that's what we'll see. Rav Goren is a religious activist. You're allowed to change prayers, as we'll see. The Nachaim prayer, just to mention it, this Tisha B'Av, take a look at this Nachaim prayer. Ask yourself, how can we say this prayer? We know what Jerusalem is like today. The prayer speaks of Jerusalem as a city of destroyed and distressed and all that. That's not the Jerusalem I see when I go there. So Rav Soloveitchik reinterpreted it, says it refers to the Harabayit, but that's not what it's referring to. And so it's a problem. But fundamentally, Rav Soloveitchik's attitude is we don't change prayers. We don't have the authority. But Rav Goren thought otherwise. How can you say the Nachaim prayer with the old version? You have to change what it says. And for Rav Goren, you don't only change it on Tisha B'Av, you change it today, the day we conquer it. This isn't something just from 67. Already in 1950, Rav Goren published a Haggadah in the army. What does the Haggadah say? Shata avde l'shana haba b'nei chorim. Now we are slaves. Next year we'll be free men. How can you say that? Now we're slaves. We all said it last month, but how can you say now we're slaves? We're not slaves. Kal v'chomer, you're not a slave. Maybe in Chutz La'aretz you could say we're a slave of sorts, but in the reborn Jewish state, how can you say you're slaves? Rav Goren said you can't. So he changed it to Etmol hayinu avadim. Previously, yesterday we were slaves. V'hayom b'nei chorim. Not next year we'll be b'nei chorim. Now we're b'nei chorim. In Birkat Hamazon, he changed it to Yolichenu Komyut Be'artzenu, not Le'artzenu, not you should bring us to walk upright to the land. We're in the land. By the way, Sfardim already have said Be'artzenu. And this is where Rav Goren departs from the standard religious Zionist approach, and even from the chief rabbinate. Rav Goren was a religious activist. He believes that halacha does not stand still. Our prayers must reflect our reality. How can you speak of a desolate city when Jews are thriving in it? Rav Goren had no problem changing texts of prayers, saying Hal with a bracha, things of that nature. This is our obligation as religious Jews, he thought. Halacha is not just something on the books, it has to be alive. Your prayers need to reflect the reality you see. How can you say a prayer that doesn't reflect the reality? But very different than Rav Soloveitchik. From the chief rabbinate of the IDF, he becomes chief rabbi of Tel Aviv in 1971, and his Sephardic counterpart was Rav Ovadia Yosef. Thus began their working relationship that was to have incredible ups and downs in the next decade. He becomes Ashkenazi chief rabbi of the state of Israel in 73. So I guess in 83, his term was up. And with this, the controversial period of Rav Goren's life really begins. And it starts with the greatest halachic dispute ever to hit Israel. I don't have time to go into it now. It's known as the Langer case. Rav Goren was able to free these children who were regarded as mamzerim. He went against other Batei Din, and he formed his own. He went to get the chief rabbinate based in. He formed his own based in, and this really led to massive attacks on him from the Haredi world, really pushing him out of regular rabbinic circles, because he was regarded as not an authentic halachic authority after this. Although if you read what he wrote, everything in there is based on halachic sources, but the Haredi world was having troubles with him already, and this they used to finally put an end to him. In fact, Rav Elyashiv, the famous Rav Elyashiv, resigns from the chief rabbinate when Rav Goren becomes chief rabbi, because he says he cannot work with him. Rav Elyashiv was on the chief rabbinate. Had Rav Goren never become chief rabbi, Rav Elyashiv would have remained a dayan. He would have collected his pension and just been a Talmid Chacham. But he wouldn't have been the Haredi Gadol Hadar. It's only because he left the chief rabbinate, then the Haredim could come to him and regard him as the Gadol Hadar, because they can't accept someone who's involved with the government rabbinic institutions. And Rav Elyashiv, he changed the attitude of the Haredi world. Before Rav Elyashiv, the Haredi world's approach was, we don't want anything to do with the chief rabbinate and the Batei Din of the Israeli government. Rav Elyashiv, who came from that world, he changed that approach. That is the old approach of Rav Shach and the Steip, where he said, no, we will conquer the chief rabbinate and we will conquer the Batei Din. And that's why so begins all the problems now that the religious Zionists have with the Haredim and the chief rabbinate, the Batei Din, the conversion problems. It's all because Rav Goren becoming chief rabbi and Rav Yoshev then leaving the chief rabbinate and changing the Haredi perspective. It's quite fascinating. There's a lot to speak about, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the all about Rav Goren and the Langer case. I published a letter from Rav Goren to Shaul Lieberman, and Rav Goren says, although it was very painful, obviously, this great halachic dispute, when even people like Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach say that you can no longer rely on Rav Goren's halachic decisions, Rav Goren says, now that I'm not even accepted by them, I'm not part of their world, I can decide halacha the way it should be decided without looking over my shoulders, without always being nervous, because mamanashach, they don't accept me anyway. Rav Goren's main point was that this person, Langer, who married this Jewish woman, that he had never really converted. And although he lived as a Jew, he wasn't converted. And therefore, when he divorced her and she remarried without a get, the children were not mamzered. His major argument was that there never was a conversion. He had a side argument where he said that even if it was a conversion, since we know that he never lived as a Jew, he even went to church, therefore the conversion's never valid. And just for the sake of irony, the Haredim attacked him and they said you can never void a conversion. Once a conversion is done, it can never be voided. Now today, Haredi Batei Din all over the place void conversions, and they're using the same argument that Rav Goren used and they attacked him for. For the rest of Rav Goren's life, he was an outcast in the so-called Haredi yeshiva world. Other than at Yeshiva University, the Rabbinical Council of America, he was not welcome to visit any of the great yeshivas. The Agudas Rabbanim in America didn't welcome him. I don't know what the situation was in London, but he had plenty of power as a chief rabbi, but he didn't have Torah influence the way he used to. And these great rabbis, they need their peers. They need to write approbations to Sfarim. The only rabbi outside the religious Zionist world who defended him was the great Rav Yosef Henkin, Rav Henkin in New York. He was quite old at this time and would soon pass away. It could be in another 100 years, all the fighting of Rav Goren will be forgotten and his works will enter the mainstream. It's happened before. I hope so, because his works on halacha about the holidays are really outstanding. His method of presentation, the questions he asked, he's the first one to write halachic essays about the way he did about the holidays. When Rav Goren's term ended in the early 1980s, there's widespread relief that he was off the stage. He had lost in his battle to remake Eretz Yisrael Judaism, and even the religious Zionists had tired of him. I know that the Jews of England had tired of him. You might recall that his battles with Emanuel Jacobovitz, he said that after Emanuel Jacobovitz expressed the viewpoint that Israel should give back land if it will bring peace, Rav Goren announced that the Jews of England should spit out Rabbi Jacobovitz because he's unworthy of serving as an Orthodox rabbi, certainly as a chief rabbi. Rabbi Jacobovitz wrote about this. He went to Rav Soloveitchik, and Rav Soloveitchik said, speak your conscience. Although Rav Goren assumes a more private role, he once more came to the public's attention with a ruling shortly before his death that soldiers are forbidden to help destroy Jewish settlements. This becomes a big deal in the Gush Katif evacuation. Other rabbis join in his ruling, but Rav Goren is the first one to give such a ruling. What he said is, if the army tells you to eat treif or to violate Shabbos for no purpose, you have to ignore it, obviously, and if they put you in jail, they put you in jail. So too, if they tell you to uproot settlements in Yehuda and Shomron, these are biblical Judaism, this is biblical Israel, you must refuse. And shortly, and the army threatened to put him in jail. He said, put me in jail. But he dies in 94. And the tragedy is unbelievable. By the end of his life, Rav Goren was telling his followers not to say the prayer for the state of Israel. I don't know what you do in your shuls there. A United Synagogue, I don't believe says the prayer, but we all say the prayer in America for the state of Israel. We say it in Israel. In fact, Rav Goren didn't even see it as Reishi Smichas Gosenu at the beginning. He saw this as we've really started the redemption, not just the beginning. Rav Goren is the one who sees the state of Israel and the army as holy. And yet he saw them as holy. Now he came to view them as destructive, as basic Torah values. Rav Goren, there always had been religious leaders in the government in Israel, who I guess you could say were scoundrels. But that didn't change the fact that the state of Israel was holy. The army was holy. But now, with the order to evacuate Jewish settlements, even before they did it, they announced their intention to do it. That's for Goren. He thought this is something entirely different. This isn't just a bad prime minister here or there. This is the Israeli government as a whole, with the army, forcing us to violate Torah law. And therefore, by the end of his life, for him, it was the land of Israel. We need a new state of Israel, a state of Israel that we can respect. So again, the tragedy is unbelievable. But we shouldn't forget that there's a lot more to Rav Goren than that's just his attitudes with the state, his mamachtiyut. He was important in many other areas. He's the first supporter of women's prayer groups. They're sort of going out of style, these women's prayer groups, because now they have these like quasi-egalitarian minyan. But these women's prayer groups are women who come together and would do davening, even recite Dvarim Shel Kedusha. Although later he said that his position was not l'ma'aseh. It's very sad we no longer have figures like him, even though we can do with all the controversy. Who other than Rav Goren would examine the Masada Tefillin and discuss their halachic status and whether the Masada fighters could commit suicide, or kidnapped soldiers for that matter, could commit suicide? It was Rav Goren who ruled that non-Jewish Israeli soldiers should be buried with Jewish soldiers. He was the first rabbi to permit organ transplants in Israel. He was the first one to accept brain death. And as we've seen, he dealt with army halacha. If the army has to leave an opening for the Palestinians, in the siege of Beirut, this was a question that had not been dealt with in history in maybe 2,500 years. And Rav Goren deals with it. There's in the biography in Rav Goren, Rav Yosef Klausner, a Rebbe in one of the yeshivas in Israel, says, quote, Rav Goren represented the total hashkafa of what the Haredi camp could not accept. He wasn't just different, he was the opposite of them. He was the last advocate of a dynamic halacha, a halacha that sees the state of Israel as the beginning of a new era, where we need a new code of halacha. It's halacha, but it's not the same halacha as we had in the Galut. You can't just look at the Ram Masochos Moachim. We're now in the state of Israel, where Jews are running everything. We need a dynamic halacha. And ultimately, he fails, because even the religious Zionist rabbis were unwilling to go along with it. Remember, his path would have meant a complete break with Haredi Judaism, as his halacha is different than the conservative halacha of the Haredim. And at the end of the day, the religious Zionists don't want there to be a schism with the Haredi world either. Rav Goren also didn't want it, but he must have realized his approach would lead to that. And I think we conclude, though, by saying that Rav Goren was really the most original posek of our times. If you look at his writings, it's everything he touches is originality, things you never would have imagined before. But in the end, he failed, perhaps because traditional Judaism is conservative with a small c. And all the changes he's speaking about, if they come, they're going to come in slow baby steps, and not the sort of revolutionary halachic approach that Rav Goren seemed to want to do. So I think I went maybe 10 minutes longer than I should, but I'm happy to take some questions, Neil, if anyone wants. No one's typed anything in, but if anyone wants to, or speak up if anyone's interested.
Yep, great. There is a few minutes if anyone has got something they want to mention or ask Professor Lyon, Professor Shapiro.
Hi, can I ask a question?
Yep, go for it.
Sure.
Just you mentioned that he stopped saying the prayer for the state towards the end of his life. I was just curious,
Yes.
which specific incident would have caused that? They hadn't started evacuating settlements at that point.
No, but they you're right. The settlements Gaza was 95. He dies in 94, right? But they had already started announcing that they're going to, and that they're prepared to. You have Yitzhak Rabin expressing the viewpoint, and he thought that, and they announced that they're going to, and there's all sorts of discussion what people should do if it comes to this, and that's why in his shul in Tel Aviv he thought that this is a government. He didn't live, fortunately for him, he didn't live to see what would happen, because who knows his reaction. But already before it was Lama'aseh. Now, there had been small, like Israel had always had when you have these illegal settlements popped up, Israel would close those ones down. But Rav Goren saw the direction it was going, and he said that any government that's willing to put this on the table is not a holy government anymore.
Thank you. And just another quick question: does he have any notable descendants?
Well, his daughter is a judge. But he has descendants and full of religious family, very large family. None of them are famous or anything like that. No big rabbis or anything. Incidentally, after he died, I published this about a year ago on the Sfarim blog. I discovered Rosalman Nehemiah Goldberg's letter to the family talking about Rav Goren, how great he was. And now he doesn't have any descendants of any. I met one of his grandson-in-laws.
Recording in progress.
They kept me up to date.
Recording stopped.
And there's a Shabbos room there now. Oh, yes, for a long time.
Are you stopping the recording?
I haven't yet, no, but I think someone else, I think they've just gone offline again. I think there was just a...
It's okay, just put them on mute, Neil.
Okay, it's saying recording. Okay, it's on.
Yeah. Was there any... anyone else want to ask a question?
Okay, well then, I thank you all then for coming out. Hopefully our paths will cross again in person. But until then, the wonders of modern technology, we can connect with each other. So I guess we could also say that, that Yom Yerushalayim is a good day. We should recognize it. The non-religious don't recognize it. But this is a day that everyone, even the Haredim, should not say Tachanun. Because although Yom Ha'atzmaut, we can understand the Haredim, the state, this and that, but the Yom Yerushalayim commemorates, saving of Jews in a war and gaining territory, holy territory. So there should be no reason for any opposition. There's nothing political about Yom Yerushalayim. So at least that's my opinion.
And Yom Chevron? Yom Chevron, that's not political.
Well, I don't know. Yom Chevron. Chevron's not Yerushalayim. It's not so important. I'm not such a great fan of Chevron. The people there, I'll tell you, we have a group from my university. I went to Chevron. I went to Chevron last summer. I took the tour. I gave them a donation. Very interesting. This winter, a group from my university, University of Scranton, group of Jews, no, it's a group of non-Jews, mostly Catholics. They went to Israel, a tour of the Holy Land, and they went to Hebron. They went both to the Marisol Pela, the Jewish side, and then they went to the non-Jewish side, and they went to the Jewish side, just to see. They're not political. Do you know things were thrown at them? And they were verbally abused, like little, like they said, little pieces of like batteries and things were thrown at them, and they were verbally abused. Forget the Chil Hashem, that these are people who are not anti-Israel at all, far from it. And they go there as tourists, and they're abused. And next time they asked me for the donation, and anyone could say it, and what can I say? How can I give to this organization when people I work with came back and I had to explain to them how Jews, who they have such respect for, how Jews could treat them like this. So what am I supposed to say other than these are, it was so disappointing to me. So I'm no great fan anymore of Hebron. I don't know, Neil, you can maybe cut this out of the video that goes on YouTube.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, we'll stop the recording now, but we really appreciate
it was,
your time.
That to me was okay. Thank you all.
Thank you.